On the Common Link Theory, CLT, by Fahd Alhomoudi. The difference between sound and unsound hadith. On the difference between sound, sahih, and unsound, da'if hadith, it should be made clear that the bulk of the hadith were rejected by muhaddiths for various reasons. Some on account of the transmitters and some due to the text itself. Scrutiny of the isnads in particular led to the muhaddiths to develop a system of different categories of reliability, of which only the utmost rigorous were preserved. In hadith collections we find, for example, noticeable differences between the number of hadiths that the muhaddith decides to include in his written collection compared to the number of hadiths he memorizes. The famous muhaddiths who are known for memorization have been listed in several biographical dictionaries. One was by Ibn al-Jawzi, who aims to encourage people to follow the path of great muhaddiths. Among those muhaddiths is Ibn Hanbal, about whom Abu Zur'a said he memorized 1 million hadiths. Yet by looking at his musnad we only found about 30,000 hadiths. Abu Dawood, who died in 275, said, "I wrote 500,000 of the Prophet's hadith, but I have selected only 4,800 of them to include in the Sunnah." These examples show us that the muhaddiths did not authenticate, nor did they include all of the hadiths they transmitted. In terms of their theoretical classification, some traditions were considered to have been transmitted by upright and accurate transmitters and contain no abnormalities or weaknesses, whereas the weak traditions did not have these qualities. Ibn Salah, al-Tahnawi, Ibn Hajar, and others have explained the categories of the weak hadiths. Of these, the categories most closely related to our study are the following, in descending order of spuriousness. Mursal, a hadith narrated by a follower, those of the second generation of Muslims who did not see the Prophet but accompanied his companions from the Prophet directly, and the companion will be passed by in this case. Munqati', an isnad that has a link missing at the beginning, middle or end. Mu'dal, an isnad having 2 or more missing narrators in a row, anywhere in the isnad. Shadh, a hadith narrated by an authority contradicting what has been reported by the majority. Munkar, a hadith in which a defect impugning its soundness is detected in either the isnad or matan, although it appears to be free of the defect. Mu'allal, a hadith narrated by a transmitter which has a defect impugning its soundness is detected in either isnad or matan. Mudallas, an isnad that has a concealed defect. Muttarib, a hadith that has been reported in slightly different forms through equally strong isnads. Maqloob, a hadith that has been attributed to someone other than its real authority. Mawdu', a fictitious narration that has a fabricated isnad. Unlike the above categories, which rank the historical authenticity of hadiths, the following categories classify the ultimate source who supposedly contributed a hadith, and did not include either its authenticity or weakness, although some Western scholars mistakenly include them within the above categories of weak traditions. Marfu', an isnad that goes all the way back to the Prophet. Mawquf, an isnad that goes only back to a companion. Maqtu', an isnad that goes back only to a follower. 3. The meaning of tafarrud. Understanding the definitions employed by Western scholars and muhaddiths in their separate discussions about sunnah, in addition to the differences between accepted and rejected hadiths, enables us to clarify the meaning of tafarrud and demonstrates where Schacht went wrong in his study of isnad. Building on this exposition, I will proceed to spell out the most essential topics derived from and related to tafarrud that one must understand in order to grasp a clear picture of the CLT. 1. The effect of tafarrud on the transmitter's credibility. 2. The effect of tafarrud on the hadith itself. 3. The differences between a hadith that has tafarrud yet is narrated by a reliable transmitter and one transmitted by a weak transmitter. It is my aim to clarify the different forms of fard, their respective characteristics and validity, which in turn will provide a more detailed illustration of the structure of the CL phenomenon, and why Schacht has failed to understand it. There are 2 main types of fard. One goes back to the companions, and one which goes back to the followers of the companions, or even later transmitters. The first form of hadith specifically refers to one narrated from one companion by one transmitter or the successors. Some examples of companions who fall into this category are Harib ibn Khanbash, Amr ibn Shahar, Urwa bin Mudarris, Muhammad ibn Safwan, and Amr ibn Taghlib. There are also companions who followed their sons to narrate their hadiths, among them Musayyib ibn Hazan, Umayr ibn Qatada, Malik ibn Nadla, Shakal ibn Humayd, Haddad ibn Had. Schacht, however, excludes this first form of fard from the CLT when he states that the tradition would be authentic if it reaches back to the Prophet or one of his companions. Nevertheless, we should take into account the possibility that several companions narrated one particular hadith and that each one of them transmitted that particular hadith to a single transmitter. In this situation, although there are several lines of descent, there is no CL involved at any level extending the strands of a particular tradition. One practical example is the hadith narrated by Harib ibn Khanbash, in which he recounts the story of a young woman asking the Prophet in which month she should perform the Umrah. The Prophet responds that she should perform it during the month of Ramadan, because Umrah during this month is equivalent to Hajj. Ash-Sha'bi is the only transmitter of this hadith, but that does not exclude the possibility that this hadith has been narrated by more than one companion. In fact, among the companions who narrated this hadith are Ibn Abbas, Jabir, Abu Hurairah, Anas, and Mcgill. Describing this situation, the Muhaddith al-Iraqi introduced two terms, Shahid and Mutabbi, which would clarify the point. The term Shahid characterizes a hadith as being narrated by more than one companion, while Mutabbi characterizes it as being narrated by more than one successor from the same companion. According to these two definitions, and knowing that other companions have narrated this hadith, we can characterize Harim's hadith as shadh, not mutabbi. The second form of fard is a hadith narrated from one single companion, then by one single successor, followed by a follower of the second generation. For instance, Zuhri, who was of the second generation of followers, transmitted numerous examples of this type of hadith. He narrated over 90 hadiths, all of them narrated by one follower of the first generation. And, as Muslim states, Az-Zuhri narrated about 90 hadiths that no one else had narrated. It seems that those hadiths are not to be found elsewhere, but in actuality he was the only transmitter of that particular isnad. However, Ibn Kathir proposed a different interpretation, asserting that what Muslim states about Az-Zuhri's hadiths means that no one narrated the same isnads, but we can find the matans of those hadiths narrated by other transmitters. Al-Hakim, in fact, found other transmitters who narrated these hadiths individually, including Amr bin Dinar, Yahya bin Sa'id, Abu Ishaq al-Sabi'i, and Hisham ibn Urwa. Other examples of the second form of fard are some hadith narrated by Malik, a second generation follower who was the sole transmitter of individual hadiths from the approximately 10 different scholars of the first generations of followers in Medina. Other examples are drawn from Shu'bah, who was also the same transmitter of individual hadiths over 30 scholars in Medina. The second type of fard also applies to individual hadiths that were transmitted by a single solitary narrator of the second generation of followers. The transmitters in this form of fard are called Wihdan, although in his Al-Iqlil, Al-Hakim proclaims that Bukhari and Muslim did not include any Wihdan hadiths. This proclamation was refuted by Dahabi and others who list several Wihdan hadiths in Bukhari. Indeed, Al-Dahabi alone identifies 10 companions who were described as Wihdan. However, the similarity between Wihdan hadiths and the two previously mentioned forms of fard is confusing. Thus, Nuruddin Ittar tries to clarify this by distinguishing between the companions on the one hand of the first form of fard and the rest of the transmitters on the second form. The reason for this differentiation was because all companions stood at the highest rank of authenticity. Therefore, their hadiths, whether narrated by only one of them or in conjunction with other companions, are not to be questioned by muhaddiths, including Al-Hakim. As for non-companion transmitters, there is no single instance of this type of Wihdan hadiths to be found in Bukhari. Nevertheless, Schacht excludes hadiths narrated by a single companion from his theory, including the Wihdan narrated by succeeding companions, which has already been refuted by early muhaddiths. Schacht, however, was unaware of these two types of Wihdan hadith. Stay tuned.